Dr. Vitz, thanks for coming on. Really appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Sure. I'm a psychologist. I was trained as a cognitive psychologist long before I think you were born at Stanford. And I've subsequently become something of a general theorist. And because of, well, I'll explain. I have a kind of soft spot in my heart for atheists because I was an atheist for roughly 20 years. And so I have a certain sympathy and respect for them. So I got my degree in graduate school, my doctorate. I was a cognitive psychologist, as I said, and I was, frankly, I was fairly ambitious. I wanted to get ahead and do research. I was delighted when I got my first assistant professorship at New York University, where I started working hard and doing pretty well. And so at the end of whatever it was, 6 years or so, I got tenure. Now, as an atheist, I would say this: I was a single man. I found my atheism was compatible with me psychologically. I liked being what I thought independent, autonomous. I didn't need anything from God or anybody else, as far as I was concerned. But then some odd things began to happen. I met a wonderful young woman, and we got married. And she was an atheist too. So when we got married, we made up our own vows, with no reference to God, of course. And but it began meaning that in my life, I had a relationship that was important. A personal relationship became important. And then after a few years, we had children, and more relationship became important for me. I was aware of, rational evidence and everything for atheism. I often sort of enjoyed reading that and understanding what was being said there. But what was really beginning to happen in my life was that I was discovering how important relationships were. I had been, if you will, in my atheism, very focused on myself. Very focused on just what I wanted, what made sense to me, my notion of being independent, being autonomous, being without any needs for others or anything outside of myself. So I was very self-focused. And in that sense, it was, I was to myself, I would say, a minor deity. And I saw that as what I was, or saw that as what I was most focused on. But relationships came into my life then with my wife and with our children. Now, as I said, she was an atheist when we met and when we were married. And I won't go into her story. She had a separate story, very different. But in any case, I began to wonder what I might mean as a person in terms of relationships as they became important for my children. And so I got more and more, they opened up a lot for me. They opened up a lot of previously sort of closed doors or windows or whatever you might say. I guess turned out I had been afraid of commitment and relationships because of the possible loss of them. But these were right there in front of me, and it was either relate or not relate. And so I related, and it meant that I was growing in that sense. And it had a big impact on me. And sometime after, just before, I guess in my late 30s, I began to understand from my perspective that God was about a relationship, not about a reason, not about an argument or evidence or of the usual type. I don't know if you can prove the existence of any kind of real relationship with another person. Of course, you can prove the person's there, but you can't prove anything about the relationship. In any case, I suddenly realized that God was more of a relationship than of a concept or an idea. And as I began exploring that, I had a number of experiences that, much to my surprise and somewhat humbling, let me know that I was in such a relationship. And so from then on, as I understood it, my belief was one of a relationship that I could see every now and then exactly what was happening, and more often and retrospectively see it. And it was not about abstract ideas or reasons. It was about, in many ways, it was about love. It was about loving God and loving others and discovering the richness of that for my life. And so now here I am, a former atheist, with great respect for atheists. I think God said that he likes people hot or cold. He doesn't like them lukewarm. So I think atheists have a special, and then of course I'm giving you my interpretation, but I think that it means that atheists have a special interest for God, and special, I think his heart warms to them, especially, even if they don't know it or experience it. I've been aware, of course, of reason, and I've kept track a little bit of it, but I mean, some of the things like recently Stephen Meyer's book on the return of the God hypothesis, and an acquaintance of mine, a distant acquaintance of mine when I was at NYU, was Thomas Nagel. Nagel's a philosopher and an atheist too, by the way. And it doesn't make, and his point was that it's not obvious that simple materialism can work. He thinks there's more to it than that, but he doesn't think that there's, he doesn't come down for God, that's for sure. But he does think there's something about human consciousness that remains unexplainable from just matter. Anyway, that's all I can say in an introduction in a few minutes.
Perfect. So I'm an atheist, by which I mean I believe that everything is best explained by naturalism. I think that all the different evidences and arguments can be better explained by a natural hypothesis.
Right.
So, for example, consciousness, I think that we don't have a solution for what consciousness is. And I agree that current physics isn't complete. Our current physics can't describe everything. It's just equations of relationships between things. It can't describe the essence of what things are, just how they interact with one another.
Yes.
So it can't get to the core of what consciousness is or what energy is or what matter is. All it can say is how it interacts with other stuff.
Right. Even matter's a mystery, right? Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think that it's not really a surprise that our current physics can't describe consciousness, because physics can't describe the essence of anything. It just describes interactions and how they interact with one another.
Correct.
But I don't see any reason to believe a God exists. To me, it seems like when we look around at the universe, everything seems to be much better explained by just blind natural forces. What reason is there to think that a God is a real thing that actually exists outside of just human imagination?
Right. And so you would put my claims about a relationship into human imagination, right?
Yeah, something like that. I think
there's something like that, I suppose. Yeah.
Yeah.
And to me, of course, they're dramatically real. But I find out all of that very interesting, and what you're saying, and I'm glad you recognize that even matter is something of a mystery. To put it mildly, that the closer the physicists get to it, they just get at relation. They measure its interactions with other things, and they can do that, which is quite interesting and important. And we can't do it very, very well in medicine, and even less well in psychology, I'm afraid, because there are too many other variables around. That's the problem. I was talking with my son, and he's pretty much into physics. This particular boy, and he was saying, well, you have to remember, in physics you can not only you talk about what variables you're measuring. You can talk about the small number that you're not measuring, and you can put those off to the side, and you can even get an estimate if they're in it, if they're there. But he said, but in psychology, he said, you don't even know what all those other variables are. So you know, don't get overconfident from what physics can find out. Physics has a nicer, clearer situation for investigating causality, and so you don't even know the number of the different other variables, much less how many and what they are. So I'm a little skeptical about psychology's causalities, but not all. I can't be a cognitive psychologist and completely skeptical on that. But
well, that would make you a philosopher if you worked in the field.
It would make me a philosopher, and you know, for my sins, I'm a psychologist. That's bad enough. Sorry to put it that way.
Oh, I totally agree. All philosophers agree. Don't ever get a degree in philosophy if you want a job.
And what are you, Tom? Are you a physicist or a biologist or what?
No, I specialize in philosophy. That's why it's easy to make fun of it.
Oh, in philosophy. Oh,
yeah. That's why I'm a YouTuber. See, I have a real job.
Oh, and philosophy. Well, by the way, I think philosophy is on a comeback curve.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. I think in general that a lot of the specific experimental evidence, certainly in physics, a lot of it has been identified along with the cosmological problems that arise with it. And let me put it this way. Psychology has discovered philosophy. And that's something of a surprise. For a long time, you know, with people like Skinner, all it was supposed to be was behavior and observation and whatever. So, and a very important psychologist some decades ago now, Martin Seligman, you probably know of him. He was president of the American Psychological Association. He said psychology for the first 100 years spent most of its studying on our problems, our pathologies. And these, of course, often were cause and effect. But he said, I want to study what makes us flourish. So he discovered the virtues. And so now psychologists are studying the virtues. And can you learn a virtue? And if so, how and when and what age or what have you, or why you can't? Because some of my philosopher friends, particularly some of my Dominicans, they laughed when I said psychology had discovered the virtues. But I said, yeah, but you philosophers hadn't done much with them. You told us about them for 2,500 years, but you hadn't studied them. And some of you even told us we couldn't learn them. So anyway, but psychology, by discovering the virtues, has moved to the studying of what makes human beings flourish. And the argument is that it's through developing virtues that are found universally in cultures around the world. And they come out with the classic list of virtues ranging, you know, from justice, and prudence, or wisdom, and other things like that. But you know, these psychologists admitted that actually, you know, they're going to have to listen to philosophers now because of the nature of the virtues has something to do with philosophy, in fact. So I think that's a good sign for philosophy.
Oh yeah, sure. I think that one of the most important areas of philosophy is moral realism. I'm a moral realist, so I think there is objective morality. And I think
that's interesting. Good for you.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the areas that philosophy can do better than the sciences, because science doesn't have a grasp on morality yet. And
sure
so
doesn't.
Understanding what the moral compass should look like that could benefit humanity and benefit well-being is a very important aspect of what philosophy does, one of the very few that it has a say over.
Yes. And I think that this, all I can say is 2 thumbs up, because we need it. And to understand that there is more to reason and more to understanding than just raw empirical facts, that there is in the moral issues, there are truths that can be found by reason, and that not necessarily scientific methods may not work for you, but reason will work for you, and come to something that is true.
Well, I'd still say it's scientific facts in a sense, because I'm a moral naturalist. So I think that objective morality is grounded in natural facts of the world. So I'd still think you could still discover it through natural facts in a way.
But I agree that I would agree with that aspect of it. But I think that the use of reason as a methodology for understanding it is something that we should welcome its return to the intellectual life of the world.
Oh, for sure, definitely. Reason is definitely a valuable tool. We should definitely utilize it and not be unreasonable.
Yeah, but because a lot of people have sort of said reason doesn't really count. It has to be something you can measure.
Sure.
So good to hear that from you. Well, do you have some other issues that I should address or free associate to?
Sure. You mentioned that there were some evidences. Thomas Nagel, I've read his books, What It's Like to Be a Bat. That one's interesting.
Oh, yeah.
But I don't see how his work or Stephen Meyer's work indicates the existence of a God, because I'm pretty familiar with Stephen Meyer's specified complexity and the mathematics behind it. And I don't think the math works. He conflates two different kinds of complexity, Kolmogorov complexity and Shannon complexity. And so I don't think his arguments for irreducible complexity hold up in biology.
Yeah.
And so I don't think there's any evidence that actually indicates that a God is there. It seems to me
he doesn't in his hypothesis. He says the return of the God hypothesis. What he means by that is that there was a God hypothesis, let's say, in science maybe 300-400 years ago. And then in the subsequent period, that dropped out. And he says it because of as I understand it now, okay, and I haven't read it carefully. So I admit to that. As I understand it, he thinks that the Big Bang, the fine-tuning, the complexity of life, particularly one single-cell life, which has all this complicated DNA in it, and consciousness all have created intellectual problems that make the hypothesis, the God hypothesis, one possible hypothesis for not as a proof, but as a plausible interpretation compared to others, like some that I think the one that you mentioned about yourself.
Yeah, those are definitely some of the arguments I've thought a lot about. So like the Big Bang cosmological argument, whatever created the universe must be spaceless and timeless. But it seems like the best explanation of what's spaceless and timeless is in quantum mechanics. Quantum fields seem to be spaceless and timeless. Space-time is said to be emergent from quantum fields, and we have good evidence of that. And that seems to be better than a God hypothesis, because all of the minds we know about are in brains as far as we can tell. We don't have any evidence of like minds that are non-physical or non-spatial, but we do have evidence of quantum fields that are.
Then I'd like to suggest something. Some of the near-death experiences do imply a non-material mind finding some evidence that could not have been observed except if they were outside of their body, and that was then identified as real. And I'm thinking of some of one was a neurosurgeon in his near-death experiences and so on. So I do think there's some hint of something there.
Yeah, I've looked into those quite extensively. The near-death experiences, I've talked to several NDE experts on the topic, and there's a number of papers that go into the examples of near-death experiences. I think one of the biggest ones is a lady who had a cardiac arrest, and she went outside of her body and she saw a serial number on top of a piece of medical equipment.
Yeah.
That one's one of the ones listed in Craig Keener's book, his tome of like 1,000,000 Miracles, like 500-page book. But when it's investigated, those kinds of miracles are found out to be not very reliable. Like the account comes from a single professor at a college who doesn't give hospital name. There's no accounts of the doctors. There's no medical records. There's no medical equipment that is 7 feet tall that has a serial number on top, because all medical equipment, the serial number is on the side so that the inspectors can get to it and say, this is the number of the item I've inspected. So all of the facts of those kinds of cases usually don't add up when they're investigated. And so I haven't found any cases of like credible near-death experiences that aren't explained as natural phenomenon once they're investigated. Another one is the one that like someone heard a story of a red shoe in another building. They were
Pardon?
Another story of a near-death experience is where they had a near-death experience, and they heard a story of a red shoe. They said they woke up and they said there was a red shoe in the ceiling of a different building, like across the street, and they found out yes, there was a red shoe in that building in that one place that they saw it. But that can be explained by the fact that when you're unconscious, you can still hear things. You like your eardrums are still vibrating and they still send signals to your brain. And it's because your brain was shut off unexpectedly, all of the signals that are being sent to your brain are saved as conscious memories. And so when you wake up, you remember them as if you were conscious. And so you'll think that you were out of body when really it was just your body recognizing those memories into your experience while you were unconscious.
Yeah.
So it seems like all the NDEs that I found, none of them have been credibly shown to be anything that can't be explained by just normal natural phenomenon.
Well, yeah, and I guess here I'm trying to think of the guy's name. He was a neuroscientist in Virginia who wrote a book about his experience. Alexander or something. I forget.
Yes.
Anyway.
I know exactly what you're talking about because I had several conversations with experts on this topic. Ibn Alexander.
Pardon?
Ibn Alexander.
Yes. Very good. Could you go online to find it or what?
Yeah, I've had conversations about him with Alex Sarkiris several times. So we've talked about him quite a bit. I've invited him on my show a couple times too.
Has he been on it?
He didn't hear back from him.
Oh, I did. I didn't know what I was getting into, so I thought I'd find out.
Appreciate it. Also, thank you for coming on my show.
Well, no, it's fun too. As I said, I have great respect for atheists, and I, and to hear that you're a moral realist is quite encouraging.
Yeah, actually, most philosophers are atheists. It's like 70% of philosophers, professional philosophers, are atheists, but like 65% are moral realists. So the vast majority of atheist
that's good
philosophers.
To hear. I was afraid they might be all sort of relativists, but I think individual relativism is the one philosophical position that no philosopher has ever taken, because that means everything's up to each individual completely and morally, and that's absurd.
Well, there's some crazy philosophers out there. I know there's one that was a solipsist, so he thought his mind was the only thing that existed. And the class was like, we got to take really good care of Professor so-and-so, because if he goes, we all go.
We all go. Yeah. Well, you know that joke about Descartes, don't you?
Which one?
Well, this is the one, Descartes he had a long day and heavy work. And so he comes down to the bar, into the tavern, and he orders a beer and talks with his friends. And, time goes on. He finishes his beer, orders another one. There's another beer, talking with his friends, and so on and so forth. Finally, he finishes his second beer. And then the waiter comes up and said, would you like a third beer? And he said, and Descartes said, I think not, and disappeared. Anyway, there are not many philosophy jokes, but
Yep.
Anyway, I think not, and he disappeared.
Definitely. You mentioned the fine-tuning argument. That one I think is interesting too, because the fine-tuning argument is the fact that of all of the laws of physics, if we change any of them even slightly, a life from a universe wouldn't exist.
Right.
And that means that only a very small percentage of the combinations would create a life from a universe. But for each possible kind of way the universe could be, there's a possible God who might want that universe. So maybe there's a God who would want a universe of only puppies or only black holes or only hydrogen atoms. And so the spectrum of possible gods who would create a life from any universe is exactly the same as the possible number of universes that are life permitting. And so to have a God who would create a life permitting universe, it must be equally as fine-tuned as the universe itself. And so saying God solves the fine-tuning problem doesn't actually seem to solve it. It just kicks the can down the road. And it's the same probabilistic issue with the spectrum of possible gods.
Well, yeah, but that's quite a funny hypothesis that there are a whole bunch of gods as the answer to God.
Well, yeah, but that's kind of the same thing with the universe. It's like you can
Yeah,
imagine the different ways, but we don't know of any different ways. We just know of the
right.
one way. And so, if you want to say there's only one way God could be, we could just say there's only one way the universe could be, and that would solve the problem too.
Well, I understand, but I can always imagine something that would be. One of the things is I'm also convinced God does not want a clear, strong proof for his existence or non-existence, because he wants freedom of choice from us. And a really powerful argument for God's existence would destroy some of our freedom. And on the other hand, a very powerful argument for non-existence would destroy some of our freedom. And so I think we have to leave it at that.
Well, would it? Because I know that in the Bible, Lucifer and the demons, they knew God existed, but they didn't believe or didn't worship him. And so even if we knew God existed, we could still have the free choice not to worship him.
Yeah, we could join Lucifer.
So even if we had proof of God's existence, we could still have free will with that.
Sure. Oh, yes. But not as much. It would have a kind of, I would say, it would cripple the free will. It wouldn't remove it. For what,
Well, I think like my perspective is that I don't think we have free will. I don't understand if free will could be possible. But even if we could have it,
yes.
it seems like we could have a better world, a more moral world than the world that we have around us. So like God could have given us free will and said, I'll give you the option to go to this world of Earth with all of the sin and suffering and things, or you can choose to opt out of Earth and go to like your own universe. I'll just design one based on your specifications and you can just go there. And it seems like God could have done that, and we could have equally had as much equally free will, but without all of the forced bad stuff that's here on Earth.
Well, that has to do with the whole issue of suffering and how to cope with that. And so I don't want to get into all of that if you don't mind.
Okay.
I could give a response, and one of our problems is, of course, from a theistic point of view, we don't know what the end of the story is. We don't know what happens when we die. I mean, from the theological point of view. And the near-death experiences can be interpreted as, in general, supporting something there, which can be interpreted so that they're not completely. I agree. You can give the interpretation you have, but you can also give the interpretation that is given by many other people as well. That's an interpretation of what seems to be some kind of evidence, which some believe is not perfectly clear and it could be all natural. And some believe that once they've had the experience is totally natural from the beginning. So when I have a natural experience of God in my life, it's as real as anything that ever happens to me.
Well, do you think people in psychology, we know people have experiences of imaginary friends who they think are real. Like there's the one from Oliver Sacks that I remember very clearly. It's the one where people see miniature people, like they see like 3 foot tall people. Like that's where the origin of leprechauns came from. People have these like visions and personal experiences that are fake. So how would you tell the difference between a personal experience that is a result of our misfiring psychology as opposed to it being real?
Well, I would say it has to do with by the fruit you shall know it. What are the consequences of it? And for your life and for those around you. And that's the only way to tell. There is no absolute principle there that would allow you to say, oh yeah, this is one of the fakes. This is one of the real ones. You can't tell that with a lot of things that you're looking at, whether it's truly real or whether it's in some way. You have to test it. You have to touch it, taste it, smell it. Oh, it's virtual. It's not, you're virtual. You look pretty real. But, and I assume you are in your studio, but, So I don't think there is except by the fruits of things you know whether they are real or not. It's like, how do you know somebody really loves you? Or are they just trying to get close to you so they can bonk you on the head when you're asleep? Anyway, by the fruits you shall know them.
Well, to me, I think like the fruits, because you can have a delusion or something and have it give positive fruits. Like people have that all the time. People have imaginary friends when they're kids, and it gives them comfort. And so I don't see how having a positive consequence would indicate that it's more likely to be true in that sense, because it seems like there are lots of delusions that had positive consequences. It seems like,
well, I'm not saying just positive. I'm saying the fruits of it, and the fruits of it will involve truth as well as positive emotions. They don't have to be positive. Some of the most important emotions we have are negative. When we fall down and hurt our knees, that's how we learn to walk. So negative experiences are also part of the truth that we, or part of the fruits of something that are good for us. Not always, of course. Sometimes negative experiences are quite harmful. But I'm just saying that by the fruits, you will be able to judge them. And that's what we all do anyway.
I'm not sure what you mean there, because like there's many delusions that have both positive and negative consequences, like the type 1 and type 2 errors, where people used to see a rustle in the bushes and they would think it was a lion and run away and they would survive. And the people who thought it might be the wind didn't run away and they got eaten by the lion. And so the people who always thought it was a lion survived and reproduced more. And so we all have this hyperactive agency detection system, which causes us to think there's agency behind things, even when there isn't, because it causing fear in us saved more people's lives. And so our psychological delusions can cause both positive and negative outcomes and positive, negative emotions. But I don't think that's a reason to trust them. So like the fact
what if I said your confidence in all these studies that you're reading about is a form of overconfidence?
It's possible, but my standard is what I think. I start with the cogito. You mentioned Descartes. I think, therefore I am. And then I go from that there's some difference between my imagination and my reality. When I imagine a unicorn, I don't see a unicorn in front of me. So there's some difference between these two things.
Yeah.
And then I need some method to differentiate between those two things. And the method I use is novel testable predictions. If you have a model that can accurately predict the future, that's a good reason to believe that model over the other models. And that's how I differentiate imagination from reality, imaginary experiences from real ones.
Well, so I could say I could, when I've had what I would consider interpersonal interactions with our Lord, that allows me to understand my own future and predict what would happen, depending on what I did with my life, and that gives me a truthful answer to it. Which is what I get when I talk to in a different way, of course, to other people. If they tell me the truth, then I get used to it and it helps me. You learn to know that. I like you, or I don't like you because it would be because I felt somehow or other they weren't contributing to the truthfulness, to the validity of a positive life that I was trying to live.
Sure. I would agree with that. I would say that if belief in God gave you the ability to predict the future, then that would be a good reason to believe it. But I don't see how it does. I don't see, like, obviously, if you die and you go to heaven, that's really good evidence. That's a successful prediction.
We can't know that. And that's the problem, isn't it?
Yeah. But I don't see how belief in God or a God religious kind of ideology has ever been able to successfully predict things kind of like science does. Science is very good at making predictions, but I don't see how religion can do something comparable.
Well, I'm not talking about prediction in the usual sense. I'm talking about providing a rationale that when one lives by it, it expresses the truth in your life. A lot of what we mean by truth, the original notion of truth, most people think today of truth as sort of like a truth table. like in reason. But the original reason of truth, the only thing that was originally true was a person. Or sometimes you might say a bell rang true or something like that. But true wasn't applied to statements until maybe 1600 or something. And truth is related to, plighting your troth. It's relating to belief is related to believed. I mean, all of these things are related to relationship. A person is true, and that means a relationship is true or not. And so I'm just trying to say that that's one of the ways in which truth can be understood, and it's a classic way that has been essentially, you don't want to get me started, but what I'm trying to say is that we have what I call a movement from the analog to the digital. And I call it the analog to digital progression. And it's a movement from the right hemisphere to the left hemisphere. And I would suggest, I assume you know of this guy, Ian McGilchrist.
I think I've heard of him, yeah.
Well, he has a very important book. And it's about the movement of essentially so much understanding, particularly in the Western world, from the left to the right, and from the right to the left hemisphere. And he's talking about some of the consequences of this. And I see certain kinds of atheism as overly involved in the left hemisphere.
What would be like an example of how we should move to the right hemisphere?
I would put it this way. I think the integration of the right and left hemisphere is what's really needed. And I think great ideas are almost always the mapping of these two coded ways of knowing things so that you can move from one to the other. And I'm thinking, say, in physics, a really important thing in physics is a theory, let's say a mathematical theory. And let's say that's left hemisphere, that's digital. But it's just a theory, it doesn't mean much unless you can map it into observation. And you map it into observation, you've mapped it from the left to the right hemisphere. You've mapped it into something you can touch, something you can measure. And that integration of the two is at the core of the cooperation between the two. And that if you go to either one by extremes, you cause big trouble. I don't want to go into the right hemisphere. If you go completely into the right hemisphere, you become a kind of, I'm being oversimplified now, but a total right hemisphere, you become a kind of racist fascist. If you become totally left hemisphere, you become a relativist digitalizer in which all differences are your enemy. The left hemisphere hates differences. The right hemisphere loves them and valorizes them. And what you need is the integration of the two where they cooperate, which keeps the errors of each of the other from being dominant. And science does this wonderfully. I mean, I think there's a beautiful sense in which science is the integration of the two hemispheres and of the two codes. But I would also say I think this happens in the case of beauty in the arts or in music, that what you're doing is finding a way to connect and abstract to a concrete expression. And when you find that way to do it, that's where you find the greatest insights and truth. And that's how you keep away from the errors of being one extreme or the other. I've had to say something very shortly that it takes a lot more time, but.
Yeah. So you mentioned truth as a way you live your life and recognizing truth as the fruits of how you do that. Would that mean that everyone can have their own truth of the way they live by? Like, so Hindus have their truth and Muslims have their truth, Christians have their truth, Buddhists have their truth. is there a reason to think that one of those truths is better than the other truths or more likely to correspond to reality?
I would say yes, but I don't want to get into that debate. I mean, it's another long wooga wooga. And
It's a technical term, wooga wooga.
what? Oh, yeah,
That's the technical term?
It's a technical term. I use it anyway. I have two technical terms that I use in the family, and one is ugga bugga, and the other is wooga wooga. But and you know, I've thought a lot about this issue, and why one particular truth can be better, but not necessarily would it be wise that everybody had it.
What do you mean?
Well, what I sort of mean is we don't want things to be too uniform. And second, people are evolving and changing, and we're not all at the same place. I mean, if you look over the world even today, you look at tribes in Brazil and you look at different cultures, because we're at different places, the truth that will be most useful for us, most helpful, will be different. Even though one thing may be more true than another, if you're not at the right place for that, it can't help you. Just like when you're 5 years old, there's certain truths not going to help you very, very much compared to when you're 50.
But if we wanted to say like truth as in what corresponds to reality versus truth as in what helps you at a given point in your life,
Yes.
And we want to like differentiate between those two, why would you say that if someone is in a certain point in their life where it is useful to have a certain ideology, does that make it true for them?
It makes it functionally helpful and helps them grow. And then we're at different stages, just like children are. You know, you can't make truth in the abstract sense make sense to a 5-year-old, but a 5-year-old is still living and has to deal with things. What is truth for a 5-year-old? It's my mother loves me, my father loves me. That's about it, or maybe a few other things and I get mad at my sister or whatever. But
Well, that's true at all ages. So
I know, and that's what I'm trying to get at, you know. And so we're all 5 years old in one sense, and or 50 or whatever, and you're still a young man. You are. Anyway, so that's what I'm kind of trying to get at as the abstract, what's true in reality in some sort of sense is sort of a highly abstract cognitive concept that is hard to relate to when you're faced with, you know, living.
Sure. But for some people, do you think they value one more than the other?
That could be. Certainly, I think that's true. Some people look, most athletes value the truth of the physical world more than most people. Being able to cope with the physical world as an athlete is a great accomplishment. I can't do it. I'm too old and decrepit. But, you know, even when I was young, I couldn't do it that well. And there are other people who think that the most important truths are artistic or musical. And others think they're intellectual or mathematical. Anyway, I'm getting close to having to say adios.
Yeah, totally fine. Let me know when you need to go. That's for sure.
Yeah. I find you a very Tom, I'm so pleased to have met you. And if you're an atheist, God bless you. Even if you don't believe you're getting a blessing, I think.
Thank you. I've enjoyed talking to you as well. Thank you for coming on. I really appreciate it. Yeah, I definitely want to be respectful of your time. So if you want to wrap up there, that's totally
Yeah,
okay.
I do have to wrap up if you don't mind.
Sure, no problem. Thanks for coming on. I really appreciate it. And talk to you later.
Righto.